We've arrived at round 3 of the FIDE World Cup knockout tournament. 32 players remain, and of the 16 matchups in game 1, only 4 were decisive, and I'm going to take a look at one of those games. We have Alexander Grischuk, rated number 7 in the world, against Pavel Eljanov, very experienced Ukrainian grandmaster. He's rated number 26 in the world. Not an easy matchup for Grischuk. Obviously, he's the favourite, but, well, let's take a look at what happened. Grischuk with the white pieces. We've joined the game after move 34, and of course, Grischuk was in time pressure. Both players were short of time. Here you can see that Grischuk has this very nice pass pawn on the queen side, but this is matched by Eljanov's very active queen, and also he has this very nice kingside pawn majority which can be used to disrupt, open up white's king position. And in fact Eljanov could have done this straight away with e3, and this certainly gives black sufficient counter chances. Instead, Eljanov played queen e1 check, and then f4, which is even more ambitious because he's trying to checkmate white's king. Grischuk advanced. Check. The king comes up the board, and now e3 is probably still quite a decent move for black, but instead Eljanov was playing for checkmate, so he's restricting white's king, preventing it coming out, and then he wants to move his queen into the attack. And here Grischuk played king h4. He could have won with a7, but when you're very short of time, it's very hard to calculate the ins and outs of this variation. I mean, there's a very obvious continuation for black here, and that's to check and move the queen in, threatening queen takes pawn mate. But then h3, well, that's the end of the story. That's a very easy variation to see. But I think the move that Grischuk would have been worried about is queen g1, much better than checking. So that means king obviously can't move up the board now because of queen takes pawn, and there is a threat to play queen g2 and then queen takes pawn mate. And I can imagine when you're in time pressure, this would look absolutely terrifying. In fact, there is a very, very beautiful defense, and that's queen f5. The point being that this queen wants to block on h3. So, for example, here, and queen h3, and that's the end of the attack, and then the pawn goes through. I think the problem is a move like queen f5 is very hard to see. You want to block on exactly the square where the king is standing, so optically extremely difficult. I'm sure that's the move that Grischuk overlooked. Incidentally, this reminds me of a similar defence you often see in the King's Indian, where you allow a black queen to take on h2, and you've posted your queen or perhaps a bishop on this diagonal, and then the king steps aside, and then the queen checks, and then you block on g1. Okay, that's for another time. But there are similarities, but a very, very difficult move to see. So I can understand why Grischuk decided not to play a7. Instead, he marched the king forward to h4. So in a way, he's preempting queen, let's say queen g1, because then he'll just close the position with h3. But instead, Eljanov played a very good move. He brought the queen back, so threatening some nasty stuff with e3. In fact, Grischuk again has an excellent move in queen f5, and if check, then the king comes forward, and remarkably, well, it's white that is now winning this position. I mean, that is an absolutely deadly pin, and there's no way to attack the king. But again, incredibly difficult to see in time pressure. And under those circumstances, normally you play a move that simply looks the safest, and bringing the king back certainly looks the safest. Maybe Grischuk imagined that the game might end in a draw here, but instead Eljanov found a really good move. Rook g5, that gets the rook out of any potential problems with the pin with queen f5, and suddenly there's going to be deadly threats here. So this is how the game went. And now queen c5, threatening rook h5 and mate, so g4 is absolutely forced. Now the players had reached the time control, and suddenly Grischuk realised that he was in desperate trouble in this position. There's a slow motion threat here that white can't do anything about. Black's king is completely safe, so the best that Grischuk can do is simply push this pawn. And now h5. So the threat is, well, let's see what happens if white makes a queen. Then you give a check and mate on the h file. There. Oh yeah, just one more thing. If this pawn is taken, then queen c8, the queen flies back and hits the king from the other direction, and that's mate on g4. So here Grischuk has to give up his queen, but all is not yet lost, because the mate threats have been prevented, and suddenly white's pawn threatens the queen. So now we enter phase 2 of this game. Black's queen has to block in the corner, and well, let's see what happens. I mean, white has no winning chances here. White can only try to make a draw here. But let's see how Eljanov played this. His plan is to move the king over to b7, and if possible to check away with the queen and then blockade with the king, and then the queen can go crazy. Let's see what happens. So first step, to move the queen over to the king side, queen side. White has to just stay absolutely solid, and in fact Grischuk is just bringing his king over to the middle. Now it might have been a better defence to play h6 here, but it's very hard to understand the details of this kind of endgame. Grischuk felt that just bringing his king back into the middle would be good enough. But let's see what happens. Eljanov found a very subtle way to make progress. So the king marches towards the queen side. And let's keep going here. And now king c6. So the king has made a little progress up the board. Now here's an interesting moment. This shows you the kind of technique that, or the kind of idea that black is looking for. If the king takes the pawn, then the king goes back. And now white can't prevent a check and king a8. For example, king takes f3, check, and then the king goes in the corner, and then the queen is free to go absolutely crazy and to pick off these targets, the rook as well and the king are targets. So black should win that one. So instead of taking the pawn, Grischuk waited. So that means that if the king comes forward, then it's possible to take here. And Eljanov waited. This is very clever. This position is actually Zugzwang. However white moves will involve a compromise. So let's see what happens if he waits. h3. So black just waits as well. And now the pawn moves have run out. And if the rook moves back, then it's possible to move in and you don't lose this b pawn. If the king comes forward, then this is the best moment to come in. And, well, it's still not absolutely clear, but this should give black very good chances, because now this rook is loose, and in fact it should be possible to pick off the rook with checks. But okay, it's absolutely not simple. So that's the basic idea. that this position is Zugzwang. But Grischuk blundered straight away with king d4. And after this check, his king found itself in a mating net. King e5. And there's no defence to either queen d3 or queen d4 checkmate. So a sudden end, but I think a very well played game by Eljanov. In fact, this is kind of karma, because Eljanov lost a game in the European Individual Championship against Hizmatulin. Hizmatulin with white made this beautiful rook sacrifice and forced Eljanov's king forward and managed to checkmate with a lone queen. An absolutely stunning game if you haven't seen it. Hizmatulin against Eljanov, Jerusalem 2015. Take a look at it. So Grischuk has a real fight on his hands. He needs to win game 2 of their mini match to get back into the tie breaks. So big task for him today.